As we all know, technology develops and changes rapidly. This is true at any given time, but obviously even more so this year with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Most of us have worked from home at various times this year, and even when we're back in the office, technology is a constant presence in our lives. Obviously, the technology we use helps us do our work and conduct our business affairs more efficiently, but with all the benefits that it brings, there are obviously also many risks that individuals in the workplace, and especially HR personnel, need to be aware of and know how to avoid, or at the very least, how to mitigate these risks. In the digital world, we need to be more vigilant than ever of how technology impacts our everyday lives and the consequences of it. As technology develops and advances, so do our ethical obligations in relation to how we approach cybersecurity.
BAL Lawyers, Cybersecurity and Privacy. Have you ever had that nagging thought, I should be doing more? But you view cybersecurity and your privacy as if it is a chore. You often receive emails and calls offering you $1 million. You receive hyperlinks and pop-up windows, of which there is a serious influx. Have you ever had questions like, how did they find such detail? Or feared your company's security if attacks come through your work email? Imagine there is a hacker, for your benefit, a handsome James Bond. He slips in through a click here link or asks you to respond. He accesses your data room, sees docs and details galore. He finds bank details and client information, causing a great office uproar. Your Mozilla Firefox programming is a relic from the past. It has not been updated since 2009, and Bond is working this out fast. You have a large client pool, 5,000 members strong, whose tax file numbers or bank details are taken before you can ask what's wrong. Once a data bank is breached, the situation could prove dangerous, like Russian interference leading to Trump's election, which is still making us nervous. It's up to you to be on guard and verify email addresses, to not click links or have simple passwords, which can be breached by simple guesses. As technology blossoms and we grow older, it might seem too confusing, but if you know the red flags and stay on guard, you can avoid this virtual bruising. If there's poor grammar, vague references, or an overseas caller, check for credentials or a legitimate business to make the threat much smaller. Don't be rash if you're unsure and click a link without a thought. Data is valuable and much sought after, a commodity ready to be bought. Thank you.
Excellent. I hope you all enjoyed our little cartoon.
Best cartoon ever. Thanks, guys.
Anyway, so today we'll be discussing the obligations that are imposed by businesses by the Privacy Act of 1988 and the steps that HR managers can take to protect the privacy of their consumers and their staff, as well as ensuring the cybersecurity of your businesses. I'm going to go through the Australian privacy principles as they're set out in the Privacy Act, as well as discussing the responsibilities that organizations have in terms of cybersecurity and management of electronic data. And after that, Riley's going to discuss in slightly greater detail the types of cyber attacks that you may face and give you some examples and practical suggestions for how to maintain cybersecurity. But first, what is cybersecurity? Cybersecurity is the protection of electronic data against possible criminal, unauthorized, and negligent use. In an HR context, this means electronic data from both clients as well as employees. That is, many businesses store client records digitally, and this can include information such as names, addresses, bank accounts, phone numbers, birth dates, and so on and so forth. In addition to this, businesses have employee records for both current and past employees that have roughly the same sorts of information. I know that sometimes they also have information about potential employees in the form of CVs, cover letters, and academic transcripts. The reason that we think it's important to talk about the security of all this sort of information, especially now, is because, like I said, our reliance on technology in the workplace, especially where the workplace is 50 individual living rooms, has skyrocketed this year. With the increased reliance on technology, there comes an increased chance of cybersecurity breaches. Riley will get into the details of the different types of security attacks, but obviously the more we use technology, the more we expose our data to the possibility of cyber attacks. It's every employee's responsibility to be aware of and stay on top of the security of their data. Again, this is even more true when people are working from home. At work, everyone uses the same internet connection, the same systems, and so on. At home, some people have Wi-Fi cards from work, some people don't, or maybe the Wi-Fi is being slow and so you switch to your home internet. I've done it, I know other people who do it. It's a pretty easy fix when all you really want to do is get your work done. Unfortunately, it does leave us open to the possibility of cyber attacks and data breaches. And that's why, in addition to individual actions, it's important for HR personnel to be aware of cybersecurity issues and the processes in place in their workplace that can help to ensure that data is stored and transferred securely. We think that with strong, clear policies put in place by HR personnel who are confidently across the legal rights and obligations of their organization, employees can be better informed about how to avoid data breaches. As I'm sure you all know, HR personnel generally oversee employee training from the first day of employment and on through various types of professional development. What this means is that HR is in an excellent position to make sure that individual employees, as well as the organization as a whole, are aware of cybersecurity issues. We believe that awareness, training, and clear policies are key in protecting your organization from cyber attacks. Now, while this presentation is primarily focused on cybersecurity, we think that it's worth addressing the requirements of the Privacy Act that deal with how personal information should be handled and what to do if it's compromised. We want to make a joke here about how we're going to make the Privacy Act fun, but that would be a lie. It would be a sad attempt at a joke, and that would be about as good as it gets. So I hope you're all ready to go through the Privacy Act with me. The Privacy Act sets out 13 privacy principles that guide you on how your company can protect personal data of consumers and staff. Needless to say, protecting this data and ensuring that it's only collected pursuant to the law is crucial to upholding the reputations of your company. It's worth pointing out that legally, the privacy principles don't apply to all organizations. They only apply to government agencies and private sector organizations with an annual turnover of $3 million or more. These agencies or organizations are called the Australian Privacy Principle Entities, or APP entities. However, while the legislation only governs APP entities, even organizations and businesses that fall outside the scope of the Privacy Act should take the privacy principles on board when thinking about how to protect their electronic data. In other words, not everyone is bound by the privacy principles, but they are an excellent framework for our businesses wanting to act ethically and responsibly in respect of their cybersecurity. So what exactly are the privacy principles? The full list can be found in Schedule 1 of the Privacy Act, but I'm going to go through them a bit now. I'll touch upon this more afterwards, but in terms of actionable items for each privacy principle, the best thing that HR personnel can do is to make sure that the employees of your business are aware of their rights and obligations through training sessions and information seminars. All of the privacy principles deal with the collection of personal information. And personal information is defined as being any information or an opinion about an identified individual or an individual who can be reasonably identifiable, whether that information or opinion is true or not. So common examples that we come across on a daily basis would be things like an individual's name, signature, their address, telephone number, date of birth, medical records, or bank account details. The first privacy principle deals with the open and transparent management of personal information. This requires that your company, that is APP entities, implement practices, policies, and procedures to manage personal information in an open and transparent way. In practice, this means developing and making readily available a privacy policy that sets out for clients, customers, users, and so on, how your organization is going to manage personal information. Obviously, the best way to do this is to have a lawyer draft or review your company's privacy policy, but even if you choose not to do that, you should make sure that you have a good understanding of your obligations under the Privacy Act. The second privacy principle deals with anonymity and pseudonymity, and it requires that there be an option for an individual to remain anonymous when dealing with an APP entity, unless the company is required by law to do otherwise, or if it's impractical for the individual to remain anonymous or use a pseudonym. In practice, just as a sort of off the top of my head example, if you have online forms that your customers or clients fill out, one of the easiest ways to allow them to maintain anonymity is to not make it mandatory for them to put in certain data fields like their name or address if it's not directly required for you to run your business. The third privacy principle deals with the collection of solicited personal information. So this draws a distinction between personal information and sensitive information. Personal information I've sort of set out before, but sensitive information refers to information or an opinion about an individual's race, political opinion, membership of political association, religious beliefs, philosophical beliefs, membership of a trade union, sexual practices or orientation, criminal record, health information, genetic information, or biometric data. This principle deals with both personal and sensitive information, and the law differs a bit depending on whether the entity in question is an agency or an organization. So if it's an agency, it can't obtain personal information unless it's necessary or related to a function of the agency. If it's an organization, then it can't obtain personal information unless it's just necessary for the function of the organization. So it's not enough that it's just related. Sensitive information can't be obtained by an APP entity unless the person whose information it is gives consent. There are a few more specific requirements here, but that's a fairly broad overview of the privacy principle. Given that the requirements here differ based on different types of organizations, it's particularly important to be aware of what category your business falls into and to make sure that it's clearly reflected in any workplace policies that employees are expected to follow. The fourth privacy principle deals with the collection of unsolicited personal information. So this requires that an APP entity that receives unsolicited personal information determine whether it would otherwise have had grounds to collect it, such as had it been solicited, and where it does have such grounds, where it would otherwise have been collected, to ensure that it complies with the remaining privacy principles. Or if it did not have grounds to collect it, to destroy or de-identify the personal information, provided that it's lawful and reasonable to do so. The fifth privacy principle deals with notification of the collection of personal information. And it says that, it requires you to take such steps as are reasonably necessary as soon as practicable after collecting the personal information to notify the individual that their information has been collected, who it's been collected by, the purpose for which it's been collected, if there's any consequences of not all of their information being collected, and whether it's going to be disclosed to any other entities. Likewise, as with the privacy policy, if the individual, the individual needs to be told if their information is likely to be disclosed to overseas recipients as well. Privacy Principle 6 deals with using or disclosing personal information, and this prevents entities from using or disclosing information that's collected for a primary purpose or any secondary purpose, unless the individual whose information it is has consented, unless it's required by law, or if the individual would reasonably expect that the information be used for a secondary purpose. And flowing on from that is the issue of direct marketing in Privacy Principle 7. So if your organization holds information, you can't use it for direct marketing unless the individual whose information it is would reasonably expect it to be used for the purpose of direct marketing, and if the individual can easily request not to receive direct marketing communications from your company. For sensitive information, the bar is slightly higher. Unless the organization is a Commonwealth contracted service provider and the use or disclosure of the information is necessary to fulfill the contract, then the information, the sensitive information, cannot be used unless consent is given by the individual. The eighth privacy principle deals with the cross-border disclosure of personal information, and it says that if your company discloses information to overseas entity, reasonable steps need to be taken beforehand to ensure that the overseas recipient isn't breaching the Australian privacy principles. There are some exceptions to this, the most relevant of which is that if the individual consents to having their information disclosed to an overseas entity that doesn't comply with the privacy principles, or if the disclosure is required by law. The ninth privacy principle deals with the adoption, use, or disclosure of government-related identifiers. So unless it's required by law, you can't adopt a government-related identifier of an individual as your company's own identifier of the individual. And what that means is, so a government-related identifier is something like a Medicare number, a Centrelink reference number, a driver's license number, or an Australian passport number. And you can't use those identifiers to identify the customer in your own system, obviously with the exceptions of if it's reasonably necessary to do that in order to verify the individual's identity, if it's necessary to fulfill your obligations to another agency or state or territory authority, or if it's required under Australian law. The 10th privacy principle deals with the quality of personal information, and it requires that your organization takes reasonable steps to ensure that personal information collected is accurate, up-to-date, and complete. In practice, this can be achieved by allowing individuals whose information you collect to contact you in order to request any changes be made to any inaccurate or out-of-date information about that individual. The process for doing this can easily be set out in your privacy policy, as well as providing a link or an email that you can be contacted at for this purpose. The 11th privacy principle, and I promise we're almost at the 13th, deals with the security of personal information. And it says that if your company does hold personal information, you must take steps that are reasonable to protect it from misuse, interference, and loss, as well as from unauthorized access, modification, or disclosure. You must also, once the information is no longer needed, and if it's not contained in the Commonwealth record, it's not required to be kept by law, or if it's not required to be kept by law, you must take such steps as are reasonable in order to destroy or de-identify the information. Most businesses will already have archival policies in place, and it's important to be aware of any legislative requirements that regulate how businesses are and are not allowed to dispose of records and other data. The specifics of that are probably best left to a presentation about archiving, but please do be mindful of the fact that legislative requirements for archiving and disposing of information do exist. Privacy Principle 12 deals with access to personal information. So if an individual whose information you hold requests access, you must give them access unless specific exceptions apply. And the final privacy principle deals with the correction of personal information. And it says essentially, if you hold personal information about an individual and either you're satisfied that the information is inaccurate, out of date, incomplete, irrelevant, or otherwise incorrect, or if the individual requests that their information be corrected, you must take steps to do so as long as it is reasonable. If you've disclosed this information to another APP entity and the individual requests that you notify that entity about the changing information, you must also do so as far as it's practical and lawful. So that's it for the privacy principles. Thank you for coming on that little legislative journey with me. Please do keep in mind that that's meant more as an overview and it's not as comprehensive as obviously advice that's tailored to your specific situation. If any of what I've said has raised questions or concerns about your privacy policy or your general procedures, I really do recommend that you seek advice specifically about those issues. Perhaps the most important takeaway from these privacy principles, which I hope I've expressed, is that your agency or your organization needs a privacy policy and your staff need to be aware of what it says, as well as how they're required to act in dealing with personal and sensitive information. Another thing that HR personnel need to be aware of is the issue of notifiable data breaches. So this is obviously what happens if there is a loss or disclosure of personal information that you hold. This is regulated by the Privacy Act and says that if there is any unauthorized access to, disclosure of, loss of personal information that's held by your agency, and this disclosure or loss is likely to result in serious harm to any of the individuals whose data has been lost, you're required to notify the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner. This can be done fairly easily by filling in an online form, the Notifiable Data Breach form. And you must also, if practical, take reasonable steps to notify the individuals to whom the information relates that their information has been involved in a data breach. The obligation to disclose and notify, much like the privacy principles, relates to APP entities. But as I said before, it's good practice for all businesses to keep in mind, even if they are not an APP entity. Not at all surprisingly, a data breach can negatively impact an organization's reputation for privacy protection, and as a result, undercut that organization's commercial interests. It's possible to reduce the reputational impact of a data breach by effectively minimizing the risk of harm to the individuals whose data has been lost or otherwise disclosed, and by demonstrating accountability in the data breach response. This involves being transparent when a data breach occurs, which is likely to cause harm to affected individuals. And this transparency enables individuals to take steps to reduce their own risk of harm, and it demonstrates that an organization takes their responsibility to protect personal information seriously which in turn builds trust in that organization. So examples of data breaches include things like the loss or the theft of a physical device, like a laptop, or a storage device like a USB, or the loss of paper records that you printed out which contain personal information. Something like the unauthorized access to personal information by an employee who shouldn't have access to that information, the inadvertent disclosure of personal information due to human error, so for example, an email that's sent to the wrong person, or the disclosure of an individual's personal information to a scammer as a result of inadequate identity verification procedures. So as an example of what this means, if I take my work laptop home and I accidentally leave it on the bus and I don't then get it at the next stop, and the information on the laptop includes things like client data, financial records, with associated names and addresses, or other personal information, then my organization is obligated to notify the OAIC of a data breach. On the other hand, if the only things on that laptop are, say, some Microsoft Word template documents that don't have any real data in them and a list of numbers which I know to be client matter numbers, but which aren't actually identified as such in any of the forms where they're written, then there's a reasonable conclusion to be drawn that no personal information is lost or disclosed, and no individual is at a risk of serious harm from the loss of the laptop. In that case, I probably would not have an obligation to disclose anything to the OAIC. While a certain amount of responsibility for maintaining the security of your systems rests with IT departments, HR personnel do need to be aware of what to do if those systems fail or are breached. Riley was part of a similar presentation last year about cybersecurity, which was targeted more towards lawyers and legal professionals, but a point was raised in it about how one of the fundamental ethical duties of lawyers is to deliver legal services competently, diligently, and promptly as possible. So arguably, a part of meeting that duty is maintaining technological competence, including an awareness of benefits and risks associated with the technology that we use in our daily practice. Now, while HR personnel aren't bound by the same ethical duties in a legal sense, I'm sure it's clear to everybody how maintaining technological competence is important and beneficial. If you yourselves know the pitfalls of the systems that your organization uses, you are much better placed to provide guidance to your employees in how to deal with those systems. This isn't to say, obviously, that you should all go out and become IT professionals with IT qualifications. I'm sitting here talking about cybersecurity, and I have absolutely Googled how to change my password on a Windows machine. Now, the point is that you need to have an ongoing awareness of cybersecurity issues, and it will serve you and your organization well. I'm going to hand matters over to Riley now, who will walk you through examples of cyber attacks and the actions that you can take to prevent them.
Excellent. Thank you, Anna. I'll just slide my chair over. The Privacy Act really is riveting reading, and I do highly recommend that everyone who attends this conference read it cover to cover if you've not done so already. Excuse me, I was writing in this morning and got a bug in my eye, so I'll try not to rub it too much, but if I am rubbing my eye, that is the reason behind it. In the second half of this presentation, I'm going to take you through some of the statistics around cybersecurity and cyber attacks. We will look at the form of various cyber attacks that you should be on the lookout for, review some high-profile cyber attacks that have been successful, so we know what not to do, and look at the best ways that you can protect yourselves and your business from cyber attacks. First, we will look at some of the statistics surrounding cybersecurity. The Australian Cybersecurity Centre is a government department that provides advice and information on how to protect yourself and your businesses online. They are an excellent resource for small businesses to gain valuable insight on how to protect themselves from cyber attacks. In July of 2020, so very recently, they published the findings of their small business survey. The survey name is a little bit misleading as they've included medium businesses in their survey as well. Being small and medium businesses, the businesses that they surveyed were up to 200 employees. We'll provide a link to this survey and to the Australian Cybersecurity website in the follow-up email to this presentation. For small and medium businesses, fighting back against cybercrime can be a difficult task as it requires balancing business priorities against cybersecurity, and usually doing this with much fewer resources than large companies have at their disposal. So some of the statistics that came from the small business survey, the Australian Cybersecurity Centre receives on average, 1 report every 10 minutes, or approximately 144 reports per day. The estimated loss to cybercrime in Australia is 300 million per year. Of the 1,763 respondents, 62 had experienced a cybersecurity incident. 80% rated cybersecurity as important to very important. 20% did not know what the term phishing with a PH meant. And just for reference, phishing is the fraudulent practice of sending emails or text messages purporting to be from a reputable company in order to induce individuals to reveal personal information, such as passwords, credit card numbers. Sometimes it's to get them to send gift cards or things like that. Back to the statistics, nearly half of the respondents rated their cybersecurity understanding as average or below average and had poor cybersecurity practices. Nearly half reported that they spent less than $500 a year on cybersecurity. We can see from those statistics that businesses all, for the most part, understand that cybersecurity is important, that cybersecurity attacks are extremely common, and that generally small to medium-sized businesses are underprepared for these attacks. So now that we've had a snapshot of small to medium businesses and cybersecurity, we're going to look at some of the most common forms that cybersecurity attacks take. From the comfort of our own office due to COVID, we have foregone the nice glass drinking and are drinking out of our normal office water bottles. Thank you for bearing with us through that. The first form of cyber attack that we will look at, are scams. Phishing being one of those, which we briefly mentioned above. And phishing is where someone poses as a legitimate institution and lures their targets, whether by phone, email, text message, into providing this sensitive information. As we stated above, this could be the provision of personal information. It might compel the person being scammed to do certain things, like send money or buy gift cards. Sometimes the scammer will create a fake email account with the name of a manager of that business and then send the email stating to one of that business's employees, saying that it's from the manager's personal account. This is something that we have witnessed occurring. Often a company's website will have the names of managers. These are easily obtainable. Email addresses for the employees are easily obtainable. And when you create an email address in Google or Yahoo or any of these things, you can put in any name that you want. Now, most employees, or at least many employees, are not familiar with their boss's personal email and would be much more likely to take certain actions if they thought they were being directed to do so by their boss. The next group of cyber attacks that we'll look at are called malware, and they're simply malicious software that once implanted or somehow introduced into a target's computer, sometimes it's through accidental download, they're designed to attack and cause damage to a computer's server or network. There are multiple different types of malware, which are all designed to do slightly different things. Here's a brief summary of some of the different types. The first that we'll look at are viruses. And viruses are self-replicating computer programs which corrupt or modify other software on the target computer. These are generally employed to cause system failure, waste computer resources, corrupt data, and steal information. Worms are somewhat similar to a virus. They are also self-replicating programs, but generally are targeted to networks to spread across multiple computers, and they rely on security failures of the target computer to access it. There is ransomware, and it's a type of malware that can block access or encrypt data on the user, and they require a large ransom in order to release that data. And this type of cyber attack is particularly an issue because not only might the attacker make money up front from the ransom, but they could also steal that information and sell it to third parties at a later date. Many ransomware attacks use a Trojan horse method to get into your computer where they look similar to a program used by reputable organizations such as Microsoft or Google. Additionally, with ransomware, there's no guarantee that if you're a victim of ransomware and once you've paid this ransom, that they won't then subsequently reblock the computer or do the same thing again. The Trojan horse, for anyone who isn't familiar with Greek history, the Greeks managed to win the Trojan War against the city of Troy after a fruitless 10-year siege by constructing a large wooden horse and hiding soldiers in it before pretending to leave. The best looking of these soldiers, of course, being Brad Pitt. Now, when the Trojans brought the wooden horse in and celebrated their victory, the soldiers jumped out and slaughtered everyone. And this is a very similar concept applies to the malware Trojan horse. It tricks the users into willingly using the program before doing whatever malicious thing it sets out to do. These can gain access in the form of an email attachment, a link, a fake advertisement you see online. And finally, spyware. Now, spyware is software that aims to find, monitor, and steal information from the victim's computer. Using this software can allow the attacker to steal information such as logins, passwords, banking and credit information, as well as other personal or business or client information. Sometimes they can track keystrokes and do things like that to gain access to that information. Protection against most of the above scams is something that requires a mix of users being cyber safe as well as the company ensuring that their computers and networks are protected against any potential threats through the use of antivirus software and additional processes such as dual authentication, So the threat that we'll most often have to face is that of scams, and these are most often conducted through email. The following are some real life examples of where scams have been successful, and so certainly things that you want to be on the lookout for and that you'll want to try to avoid. The first scam that we'll look at eventually culminated in a court case, as lawyers we're somewhat bound to our own dogma, and we end up reverting to court cases. So in 2017, an email was, or appeared to be, sent from the CEO of Transport Safety Systems Group to their chief financial officer, Stephen Crisp, requesting a transfer of 65,000 US dollars, about 100 grand at that time in Australian dollars, to be transferred to a bank account in Hong Kong. Crisp didn't question the email, as this payment amounted to roughly an amount that was previously approved by the CEO for a software license fee. He then instructed NAB via its online banking system to arrange the transfer. The payment went through after a call to confirm it. 3 days later, and after further requests for payment were made, again via email, purportedly on behalf of the CEO, Chris started to suspect that the requests were fraudulent. I speak English sometimes. And notified NAB, who in turn contacted the Hong Kong bank to which the payments had been going to. Unfortunately, it was too late to recover the money. The defrauded company then sought certain documents from NAB to determine whether it was worth bringing a proceeding against NAB for breach of their duty. From that point on, the case gets quite messy, and it all ends up in front of the Victorian Supreme Court, as all fun things do. But the important takeaway for everybody here from this is that you must be aware that scamming emails can be very clever and appear legitimate. Given this, when such an email is received requesting a transfer of money or a transfer or access to other sensitive information, it's worth confirming that the alleged author of the email is in fact who sent that email, and that person intended for that action to be taken. Another example that's a bit closer to home, you might remember, especially if there's anybody who's working in property here, a matter of a stolen identity in 2014 that, again, went eventually to the ACT Supreme Court in the case Estelle and the Australian Capital Territory. A brief summary is that a Canberra woman was leasing her house in Canberra, where she lived while she worked in South Africa. She left the property in the hands of a real estate agency with instructions to correspond with her via email. After she left, the agents received an email from the owner from a new email address advising to send correspondence to this new email address, as the old email address had been compromised. Thinking nothing of it, the agents did exactly that. Less than a week later, which is not at all suspicious, the agents received an email instructing them to do a valuation of the property, and after a couple of emails back and forth, instructed the agents to sell the property, which of course they did for $430,000. The purported owner engaged a Canberra law firm, and I want to be very clear about that, not this law firm, and contracts were then exchanged. The funds were transferred overseas to Indonesia upon request. Again, nothing suspicious about that. And the entire transaction, except for the conversation to transfer funds for Indonesia, which was done by phone, was conducted through email. Not long after the property was sold, the woman called up her real estate agent wondering why her rental payments had ceased. She was then informed by her agent that she sold her house, and this was much to her surprise and dismay. She, of course, subsequently found out the house had been sold by fraudsters who had managed to steal her identity. She was eventually awarded $546,000 for the value of the property, expenses, and loss of net rent and interest on rent. Now, looking at this, we think this entire situation probably could have been avoided if the agent had emailed the previous email address or attempted to verify the new email address, or even if the agent or the lawyers had simply picked up the phone to confirm their instructions. In this case, really highlights the need to maintain vigilance, as not all scams are the result of computer viruses or some complex hacking system that is very difficult or very expensive to control against. Many of these are the result of human error. There we go. The next case that we're going to look at is a bit of an old example, but I included it because it's still an excellent example of where user error can allow access to even the most secure systems. In 2008, a single USB drive was inserted into a computer. There's nothing remarkable about that. That happens all of the time. However, this USB allowed access for malware to be uploaded to the network run by US Central Command. And this was the system that the US military thought was completely impenetrable. This system had no external access of any kind to prevent any type of external hacker from gaining access to the US military's most important and most secretive secrets. At the time that this occurred, it was the most significant breach of US military computers ever. It's still the most significant breach that we're aware of, although it is entirely possible that there has been more significant breaches that the US government doesn't tell us about. Although some of my fellow people living in America would stand by that the US government would never lie to them. I don't share that opinion. Anyway, following on from that, there have been reports of scammers targeting certain businesses by making USB drives with the company logo and then leaving them in the parking lot of that business. Due to the logo that's on the USB drive, people think that it must belong to a client or a colleague. They take it into their office and plug it into a computer to find out who they should give it back to. And of course, that's when the scammers gain access to the system. So the reason that we have chosen these examples, as opposed to the hundreds and hundreds of other examples that exist of cyber breaches and cyber attacks, is that in each of these above instances, it was not a complex program that allowed the hacker to gain access to the system. It was simply user error. And the removal of this type of user error through diligence and skepticism, you can eliminate many of the most high-risk forms of cybercrime. Additionally, we can instruct you on how to keep your digital system secure, which we'll go through in just a moment. But all of that effort can be wasted if you or one of your employees plugs in a USB drive that they found in the parking lot or clicks on a risky link that came from a nefarious email. The best systems can be overrun through user error. The next thing that we're going to look at is the Australian Cybersecurity Centre's strategies to mitigate cybersecurity incidents. These strategies are a prioritized list of mitigation strategies to assist organizations in protecting their systems against a range of adversaries. Implementing these essential 8 mitigation strategies is likely to be substantially more cost-effective than that company being required to respond to a large-scale cybersecurity incident. These strategies are broadly broken down into 3 categories. Mitigation strategies to prevent malware delivery and execution, kind of the first line of defense, trying to keep malware out of a computer. Mitigation strategies to limit the extent of cybersecurity incidents. So even if they get through, trying to mitigate any of the damage that can be caused by them. And mitigation strategies to recover data and system availability. So effectively, if the worst happens, being able to wipe the system and have a backup available. We're going to look at each of these strategies separately that fall into those three broad categories. And as we're going through these strategies, if you don't understand some of the terminology used, don't worry. These strategies are all available online, and we will provide a link to them in that same email follow-up to our presentation. And many of the below strategies are what you will require of your IT provider to ensure that your systems are adequately protected. The first category of strategies is to prevent malware delivery and execution. This is the first barrier to cybersecurity and attempts to prevent a successful attack. The first of these strategies is that the company needs to ensure that it has application control. And this will help prevent execution of unapproved malicious programs, including .exe, DLL, scripts, which would include Windows Script Host, PowerShell, HTA, and other installers. And again, it's okay if you don't know what any of these previous program names mean. They're simply types of programs that can do malicious things. The reason for prevention of these unauthorized applications is that non-approved applications, including malicious code, are prevented from executing if application control is properly managed. The second strategy in delivery and execution is that you should patch applications. The applications that I really need to be patched include Flash, web browsers, Microsoft Office, Java, and PDF viewers. Ideally, you want to patch mitigate computers with extreme risk vulnerabilities, those having access to very secure data or banking information, things like that, within 48 hours. You also want to make sure that you use the latest version of all applications to help prevent vulnerabilities that may exist in the older versions. And the reason that this is important is that security vulnerabilities in applications can be used to execute malicious code on systems, and patching these vulnerabilities limits that exposure. The third strategy is to set up Microsoft Office macro settings to block macros from the internet and only allow vetted macros either in trusted locations, which have limited write access, or digitally signed with a trusted certificate. Microsoft Office macros can be used to deliver and execute malicious code on systems, and this action will help to mitigate the risk that can occur. The final strategy from delivery and execution is to ensure user application hardening. In order to do this, you want to make sure that you configure web browsers to block Flash, ideally uninstall it entirely, ads, and Java on the internet. Disable unneeded features in Microsoft Office, for example, OLE. As a disclaimer, I'm actually not entirely familiar with OLE, but it is highly recommended to be disabled in web browsers and PDF viewers. Again, these are things that you would want to instruct your IT professionals to set up onto your system. If you have those, or if you have somebody that is running your accounts, that they should be educated on what these are and how to affect these recommendations. Again, Flash ads and Java are all popular ways to deliver and execute malicious code on systems. The second category of mitigation strategies is to limit the extent of cybersecurity incidents. And first is that you want to ensure that you restrict administration privileges to operating systems and applications based on user duties. Regularly revalidate the need for privileges. Don't use privileged accounts for reading email and web browsing. Admin accounts are essentially the keys to the kingdom. Adversaries use these accounts to gain full access to information and systems. Essentially, you don't want to give more accounts that type of access than is strictly necessary. This was one of the issues that was experienced by ANU in their data security breach some time ago, is that these nefarious individuals, hackers we'll call them, gained access to the ANU system and continued to bounce through the system until they gained administrator access, at which point they had access to everything that they needed. So you want to strictly limit the amount of administrator accounts that there are. Second, you want to ensure that operating systems are appropriately patched. So we addressed appropriate patching up in the first section, and this was the patch of applications. Down here, this is the patching of operating systems. So you Again, the same recommendation that you want to patch, mitigate computers, including network devices with extreme risk vulnerabilities within 48 hours. Use the latest operating system and don't use unsupported versions. Security vulnerabilities in operating systems can be used to further compromise the systems. Finally, you want to enable multi-factor authentication, including for VPNs or other remote access, and for all users when they perform a privileged action or access an important data repository. Stronger user authentication makes it harder for adversaries to gain access to sensitive information and systems. Multi-factor authentication, such as a phone app that requests approval each time a program is logged into, make it much harder for hackers to gain unauthorized access. And most of the main systems that you're going to use are going to have these. Microsoft Office has an application that everybody can download to their phone that when you log into your email address, it requires a secondary device to approve that, which is this kind of fail-safe that if the person knows that they're not logging into their email or into these secure systems, they decline to allow access, and that creates a second barrier. The final category is mitigation strategies to recover data and system availability. These are a fail-safe in case things go wrong. Ensure that your system has daily backups of important, new, or changed data, software, and configuration settings. This information should be stored disconnected and should be retained for at least 3 months. You want to test your restoration initially, annually, and whenever IT infrastructure changes. This is to ensure that this information can be accessed following a cybersecurity incident, for example, a ransomware incident. We'll speak in a little bit about a ransomware incident where they did not have an appropriate backup and it ended poorly for them. Numerous other high-profile organizations have released papers and other reports reiterating the importance of technological competence in organizations. In 2018, the International Bar Association released their, cybersecurity guidelines. While this advice was specifically directed at law firms, these suggestions still apply to all firms and organizations in order to keep data and other confidential information secure against the many threats we've been discussing. The guidelines outline a couple things that we can stay on top of and minimize any risk. These include, and we've discussed this previously, keeping software updated. This is extremely important. Generally, software suppliers will be constantly updating and patching their software, particularly if there's some sort of security risk in that. It's through these updates that any vulnerabilities in code are fixed that can no longer be exploited by these potential hackers. So next time your computer asks to do a software update, you don't have to do it immediately, but try to time it so that it'll happen overnight and it's ready for you the next day. An example of where updates were not done properly is the city of Baltimore in the United States. Again, we're both Americans. We've gone back to these US examples. So effectively, the city government had their computer systems hacked with a program called WannaCry, which was named that for obvious reasons. Computer hackers are nothing if not descriptive. So once this program had been introduced, it put all of the government systems for the city of Baltimore behind an encrypted wall. Residents couldn't pay their water bills or any type of utilities. Tickets, taxes, real estate deals had to come to a standstill because they couldn't tell who had liens over the property. Effectively, all of the city government came to a screeching halt. This went on for months. The hackers were able to obtain access to the system simply because Microsoft Office had not been updated, and consequently a vulnerability that Microsoft had fixed had remained vulnerable long past when this shouldn't have been an issue anymore. The hackers were requesting payment through Bitcoin that the city didn't want to provide and eventually had to rebuild their systems, if I remember correctly. Yes, looking at the time, sorry. When using devices that have access to sensitive or personal information, use secure internet connections. If you're reading or sending emails from your laptop or phone, be careful to do it only from secure connections. It's surprisingly easy for people to gain access to unsecured connections like what you would find in a cafe or other public area. If you do use your phone for work, make sure you have a strong passcode and that it's set to erase all data if the password is incorrectly attempted too many times, and enable remote wiping in the event that you lose your phone. USBs, again, they're an excellent way to store and transfer information, but they're also easily lost. Make sure you encrypt data and that the USB require a passcode to access it. Be wary of random USBs that you may find. Use strong usernames and passwords, and try to avoid reusing passwords, especially between personal and work accounts. Phrases are better than words, and try to use a combination of uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and symbols. A few other pro tips. Don't click on random links. Whether they come from emails or pop-ups, links are extremely common ways for scammers to get access to your system. Challenge and inquire. If something doesn't look right, it probably isn't. Verify email address and, where possible, the identities of people who are contacting you. Google is also your friend. If somebody's trying to scam you, they've likely tried the same thing on somebody else, and everybody loves to air their grievances online. By Googling the issue, you're more than likely to be able to find information to confirm whether you're actually about to win, $1 million in some random lottery that you've never heard of, or get an inheritance from a Nigerian prince who you've never met, but who desperately wants to send you millions of dollars, or if much more likely it's just a scam. Keep an eye on the ACCC Scam Watch website for the types of scams that are being reported. Tens of millions of dollars are being lost to scams, so it's serious business that the ACCC tries to be on the lookout for. It's harsh but true that lack of knowledge and inattentiveness are often the weakest link when it comes to cybersecurity. The onus is on you to not only stay vigilant and keep up to date with changes in technology, but to ensure that all of your employees do so as well. So as few red flags to look out for, there's nothing that we haven't spoken about here. These are things that you just really want to be on the lookout for. Now, as Anna has previously mentioned, you are obliged to notify the Australian Information Commissioner and the individuals who are affected by the data breach for certain losses of information. We cannot stress enough how important this is. It reassures your clients that despite the breach, you're working to look after them and that they can continue to rely on you. One easy way to do this is to publicize a statement of what happened on your website. It is important to disclose the matter so that those affected can make the appropriate decisions to protect their information or protect themselves, depending on what data has been lost. In summary, technology is rapidly changing and it's difficult to keep up, but the risks of not doing so are far too great. And I would argue that you have a professional responsibility, if not an ethical duty, to make sure you know and understand what is happening in technology in order to be cyber secure. A failure to do so simply has too many risks attached.